Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Amaka stood in front of the small wooden wardrobe, holding the shimmering white wedding gown that once symbolized dreams. It wasn't just cloth and stitches, it was memories sewn into fabric. She remembered the laughter of her sisters on her wedding morning, the trembling hands of Chuka as he lifted her veil, the promise of forever whispered between them beneath a dusty ceiling fan. But now it was just an item, a silent observer of a life that had derailed. Chuka's real estate business was collapsing like a house of cards. Rent was overdue, staff were threatening to strike, and the electricity had been disconnected for the second time in a month. Amaka took one last look at the gown before folding it into a black nylon bag. She told herself that love wasn't stitched into a dress. It was proven in what you were willing to lose to help the one you loved survive. As she walked to the second-hand bridal shop, her shoes made hollow echoes on the cracked sidewalk. The sun scorched her skin, but the heat wasn't as heavy as the weight on her chest. She remembered when she once believed that Chuka would make it big in just a year, and she'd wear this gown again for their renewal vow ceremony. But that was 5 years ago, and now the gown was just one of many things she had sacrificed: her job, her pride, her comfort. The woman at the store barely looked at her before quoting a price far below its value. Amaka didn't argue. She simply nodded, took the money, and whispered a thank you with a shaky voice. She knew she had no choice. That evening, when she returned home and handed the money to Chuka, his face lit up, not with gratitude, but with relief. "You always find a way," he said, pecking her on the cheek absently, already typing into his phone. She smiled, but the corner of her lips trembled. There was no we anymore, just her silently pulling the strings to keep them from falling apart. Later that night, Amaka lay awake in their dimly lit bedroom, her hand stretched out across the bed to feel Chuka's warmth, but he had dozed off after complaining about the internet speed. She stared at the ceiling, blinking back tears that betrayed her strength. The room, though small, was once their fortress, a place of laughter, midnight giggles, and silly dreams. But now it was filled with silence, unanswered prayers, and unpaid bills. She rose quietly, walked to the mirror, and looked at herself. Her eyes had grown dull, her cheeks sunken from skipped meals. Yet she didn't see regret, only duty. She touched her bare ring finger and whispered, "One day he'll see." Then she turned off the light, hoping morning would bring a miracle, unaware that darkness had only just begun. The journey to the village was long and dusty, but Amaka sat quietly in the back seat of the aging commercial bus, holding her handbag tightly to her chest. Inside was the title deed to a small piece of farmland, the only inheritance her late mother had left her. It wasn't much, but it was the only property Amaka could claim as hers. She remembered how her mother used to say, "No matter what happens, this land will keep your children alive." Amaka had no children yet, but Chuka's business was her child. She had nurtured it with faith, protected it with silence, and now she was willing to give up even her mother's memory for its survival. She told no one about the trip, not even her younger brother, who was likely to protest. It was better this way. Quiet sacrifice was the kind Amaka had grown used to. When she arrived, her uncle looked puzzled. "You want to sell Mama's land?" he asked, clearly concerned. "Why now, Amaka?" She gave a practiced smile and said, "It's for a project. I need the money urgently." Her uncle hesitated, but finally nodded, trusting her judgment. The next 2 days were filled with visits to a land surveyor, a lawyer, and finally a buyer. By the end, Amaka held an envelope containing 750,000 Nigerian nairas, just enough to pay Chuka's staff and cover some debts. On her way back, the bus hit a pothole and jerked violently, causing the woman beside her to vomit. Amaka said nothing. She stared out the window as the trees blurred by, clutching the envelope. She had expected to feel relief, but instead she felt strangely hollow. That land was the last part of her mother she could touch. Now it was gone. And yet, she convinced herself that she had made the right choice, because love, after all, was about letting go. When she returned to Lagos and handed Chuka the money, he was on the phone. He gave her a thumbs up and said, "Perfect timing, babe," without even asking how she got it. Amaka stood there for a moment, hoping he'd pause, embrace her, say something, anything. But he didn't. She quietly went to the kitchen and began boiling water for dinner. As the kettle hissed, her heart screamed silently. She remembered how Chuka used to write her love notes when they were broke, promising the world as long as she stood by him. But now, his promises had faded into transactions. That night, he brought home takeout and told her she didn't need to cook, as if food was all she needed to feel seen. Amaka lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, whispering to her mother, "I hope I made you proud. I hope this sacrifice means something." The following week was a stretch of empty cupboards and cold evenings. Chuka had promised that investors were coming, that a deal was around the corner, that just a little longer would make them rich. But in the meantime, Amaka had to manage what little they had left. She stopped eating breakfast entirely, claiming she wasn't hungry. For lunch, she boiled water and added a spoon of gari, pretending it was enough. Dinner was a shared plate of rice. No meat, just salt and hope. She never complained, never reminded Chuka of the money she gave. She simply smiled and said, "God will provide," even when her stomach groaned in protest. Sometimes she cried quietly in the bathroom, stuffing her face into a towel to muffle the sound, praying her tears would not drown her faith. But her faith, like their pantry, was slowly running out. One day, Chuka returned home excited. "I met someone today," he said. "A man who knows someone who can introduce me to a governor's aide." He spoke fast, with fire in his eyes. Amaka nodded and smiled, though she was seated on the floor sorting beans with trembling fingers. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the hunger, the sacrifice, the humiliation would all be worth it. But the part that hurt the most was not the hunger. It was how invisible she had become. Chuka no longer looked at her the way he once did. No longer said thank you after meals or touched her shoulder when he passed. She had become part of the furniture, necessary, but unappreciated. That night, while he snored beside her, full from the food she had scrapped together, Amaka stared at the cracked ceiling and whispered, "God, please don't let me break before the blessing comes." On Sunday, Amaka fainted in church. Her head hit the tiled floor near the altar, and worshippers screamed. She was rushed outside and revived with water and prayers. "She needs to eat," the usher said, looking at her pale face. Chuka was embarrassed. He scolded her when they got home. "Why would you embarrass me like that? Why didn't you tell me you were feeling dizzy?" She looked at him with tired eyes and said nothing. What was there to say? That she hadn't eaten in 2 days, so he could have enough for his next business meeting? That she had turned fasting into a lifestyle? That her body was slowly giving up while her heart still clung to hope? She simply nodded and walked into the kitchen, boiling water again, not to cook, but to stay warm. That night, she didn't pray. She just cried, not for herself, but for the love she feared was dying. The sun was barely up when Amaka put on her worn-out sandals and tied her scarf. She had one mission that day: ask her ex-colleague, Mrs. Anom, for a loan. It was something she swore she would never do. But desperation has a way of humbling pride. Chuka had called her the night before while at a supposed investor's dinner, telling her he needed 200,000 Nigerian nairas to secure a last-minute printing deal. "We'll make triple in 2 weeks," he promised. Amaka had no savings left. She had sold everything of value. The only option was to swallow her pride and ask. When she arrived at Anom's boutique, the woman was surprised to see her. She was now rich, with gold bracelets clinking as she welcomed Amaka. But once she heard why Amaka came, her smile faded. "You? Still struggling with that your husband?" she asked loudly, her voice sharp and belittling. There were other customers there, and their stares stabbed Amaka like knives. Anom didn't make it easy. She asked unnecessary questions. "You mean after all your sacrifice, you people are still broke? Didn't he promise you heaven and earth when he married you?" Amaka nodded silently, her fingers digging into her wrapper to keep her hands from shaking. Anom eventually agreed to lend the money, with a 15% interest. She even made Amaka sign a small agreement with a witness from her shop. Amaka, humiliated, signed without flinching. She had no time for ego. She left the boutique under the weight of shame, blinking rapidly to keep tears from falling in public. On the way home, she stopped by the roadside and sat on a bench. Her body was tired, but her soul was heavier. She thought of the job she once had, how she had trained Anom in customer service. Now she was begging the same woman. She wondered how her life became this fragile. But still, she clung to hope. Chuka had a dream, and she had faith in it. That had to mean something. Later that evening, she handed Chuka the money. He hugged her briefly and said, "You always come through." Then he rushed into the bedroom to get dressed for yet another business meeting. Amaka sat on the edge of the bed, listening to him hum as he picked out his perfume. She waited for him to ask how she got the money. He never did. Instead, he sprayed himself generously and said, "By this time next year, you'll never need to beg again." Amaka smiled weakly, but her heart whispered, "I wasn't begging for me." When he left, she stood in front of the mirror and stared at herself. The scarf hid her thinning hair. Her eyes were tired, the corners of her lips cracked. She touched her cheeks, once full and radiant, now sunken. The mirror showed her reflection, but it felt like a stranger was staring back. Weeks later, Chuka returned home with a new car and a wide grin. He danced into the house like a man who had touched gold. "Baby, we made it," he shouted, lifting Amaka off her feet. "The governor's aide signed the deal. They've transferred the plots, and we got 40% up front." Amaka laughed joyfully for the first time in months. She danced with him, tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but relief. She thought of all the nights she went to bed hungry, all the prayers whispered in the dark, all the sacrifices. It was finally over. They had made it. That weekend, Chuka took her shopping, bought her a new phone, and even mentioned a vow renewal ceremony to celebrate their rise. Amaka's heart soared. The man she had loved was back, or so she thought. Then, on Monday evening, Chuka walked into the house holding a brown envelope. "Babe," he said casually, placing it on the dining table, "I need you to sign these. It's just some prenup paperwork. The lawyer said it's standard, especially now that we're big players." Amaka frowned, confused. "Prenup?" she repeated. "Why would we need that? Everything you have, we built together." Chuka didn't flinch. "Exactly. That's why it's no big deal. Just a safety net in case anything ever happens. You know how these things go." He smiled and kissed her forehead, but his touch felt distant, cold. Amaka didn't pick up the papers. She stared at him, her heart pounding. "So you don't trust me?" she asked softly. Chuka laughed. "It's not about trust. It's about protecting what we built. Please don't make this a thing." But it was already a thing. It was everything. That night, Amaka couldn't sleep. The papers remained on the table like a ghost. She sat beside them, rereading every word. It was legal jargon, but the intent was clear. In the event of divorce or death, Amaka would get nothing. No property, no shares, nothing from the company she helped build. She felt like a fool. All her sacrifices reduced to a signature. When Chuka came out of the room, he found her crying silently, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Why are you making this dramatic?" he asked coldly. "If you didn't have anything to hide, you'd just sign it." Amaka looked up at him, her eyes red and filled with disbelief. "I gave you everything, Chuka, even my dignity, and now you want to erase me." He rolled his eyes and walked away. That night, Amaka cried again, not because she was poor, but because she had been made to feel disposable. The next morning, Chuka prepared to host his new investors at home. Amaka cooked and cleaned, trying to focus on hospitality, not heartbreak. Her hands moved automatically, stirring stew, setting plates, arranging cushions. But her mind replayed last night's moment like a stuck record. Every time she looked at the envelope still sitting untouched, she felt her chest tighten. After the guests arrived, 3 sharply dressed men and 1 elegant woman, Amaka served them drinks with a smile, masking her pain. Chuka acted like the perfect husband, praising her jollof rice and introducing her as the heart of the home. But beneath the laughter, Her soul trembled. She couldn't forget what he'd said. How easily he discarded years of loyalty for a line in a document. After the guests left, and the house was quiet again, Chuka picked up the envelope and placed it in front of her. "We need to finalize this, Amaka," he said. She stood silently, staring at him with tears gathering. "I won't sign it," she whispered. His eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." She raised her voice slightly. "I won't sign anything that treats me like I'm just passing through this life with you." Chuka's face changed. The warmth vanished. "You're being ungrateful," he snapped. "You think I got here because of jollof rice and emotional support? I worked for this." The slap wasn't physical, but it hit harder. Amaka gasped. Her voice broke. "You worked? I bled for this. I gave up my body, my job, my inheritance. And you think this is about rice?" But Chuka had already turned his back. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "I'll find someone who believes in my future, not my past." That night, Amaka cried again, this time not on the floor, but in the guest room. She had taken her pillow there after Chuka locked their bedroom door behind him. She lay on the small bed, curled up like a child, replaying every sacrifice, every moment she believed love was enough. The tears didn't come in bursts. They flowed slowly, soaking into the pillow, staining her soul. She thought of leaving, but where would she go? Everything was tied to him. Her identity, her effort, her years. She pressed a hand to her chest and prayed for strength. But a seed had been planted that night, not just of heartbreak, but of awakening. She would never be the same again. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Amaka noticed it, faint, flowery, and unfamiliar. Chuka had just returned from what he described as a brief land inspection in Lekki. He walked in, humming and unusually cheerful, tossed his suit jacket on the couch, and headed to the shower. Amaka picked up the jacket to hang it and caught the scent. At first, she paused, unsure. Then she brought it closer. The perfume was delicate, expensive, and definitely not hers. A woman's scent. Not the kind that clings from casual contact, but one that wraps around a man like ownership. She stood frozen for a moment, heart racing, brain scrambling for excuses. Maybe he brushed past someone? Maybe it was an air freshener in a car? But deep inside, she knew. Something had changed. Something was wrong. The scent was not a mistake. It was a message. When Chuka came out, she didn't say anything. She sat on the couch, folding clothes slowly, watching him from the corner of her eye. He was different. His smile was too quick, his eyes too evasive. He complimented her hair, something he hadn't done in months, and then asked casually if they could repaint the house. "It's time we matched our new status," he said. Amaka smiled, nodded, but inside she felt like crumbling. That night, she waited until he slept before gathering the clothes from the laundry basket. One of his inner shirts reeked of the same scent. She clutched it to her chest and cried. She cried for the woman she used to be, loved, respected, seen. She cried for the dreams that were now soaked in betrayal. But more than anything, she cried because the woman whose perfume now clung to her husband had not just taken her place in his heart. She had taken her peace. The next day, Amaka tried to talk to him. Not about the scent, not yet. She asked about the land inspection who was there, and if she could help manage client bookings again like she used to. Chuka dismissed her gently, saying he needed a different image now. "You know, upscale. You're great, Amaka, but we're operating in new circles." That stung. Her efforts, once enough, were now inadequate. He didn't raise his voice or insult her, but the dismissal was loud. She wasn't the woman who fit into his new life. Amaka excused herself and went into the kitchen. She stood there with her back to the wall, biting her fingers to stop herself from screaming. She wanted to believe it was just business, just pressure, but her gut screamed otherwise. She had lived with Chuka long enough to recognize when he was hiding something. And this time, it wasn't just a bad deal or debt. It was someone. A woman who smelled like betrayal. That night, Amaka waited until Chuka fell into his usual deep sleep before reaching for his phone. She hated herself for doing it, but silence had never helped her. She needed to see, needed to know. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the phone. He hadn't changed the password. still using his mother's birthday. As she scrolled through his messages, everything felt like a dream she wanted to wake up from. There were casual chats with clients, office notifications, even a few harmless flirty texts from business contacts. But then she saw the name, Rita, saved simply with a single heart emoji. Her fingers froze. She tapped the thread, and her world caved in. Last night was magical. Can't wait to feel your lips again. She doesn't see what a king you are, but I do. Amaka couldn't breathe. The screen blurred as her eyes welled up. Every word cut deeper than the last. This wasn't business. This wasn't a phase. Chuka was in love with another woman. Amaka sat there for minutes, reading and rereading the messages, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. Some of the texts dated back weeks, overlapping with the time Chuka had asked her to sign the prenup. It all made sense now. The sudden coldness, the exaggerated business meetings, the fake smiles. He was building a life. Just not with her. She dropped the phone on the bed like it was fire and ran into the bathroom. She fell to the floor and wept like a child. No screams. No words. Just pain, thick, consuming pain that clogged her throat and stole her strength. She had spent years sacrificing, believing in him, defending him when even his family called him a failure. And this was her reward? A heart emoji beside another woman's name? She wanted to rip her chest open and remove whatever was left of her love for him. But even in her anguish, she still loved him. That was the worst part. When she came out of the bathroom, her eyes were red and swollen. Chuka was still asleep, peacefully snoring like nothing was wrong. Amaka lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, numb. She didn't confront him the next morning. She didn't scream or slap him. Instead, she served him breakfast like she always did, plantain and eggs, just the way he liked it. He thanked her with a kiss on the forehead. She smiled faintly, but inside she felt like a ghost. Her heart had split in two, one half bleeding, the other preparing to survive. She didn't know what she would do next, but she knew something had to change. She couldn't continue being the woman who begged for crumbs of affection from a man she built from dust. Not anymore. The boutique was luxurious, glass walls, gold trimmings, and soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. Amaka felt out of place in her faded Ankara gown and rubber slippers, but she walked in with purpose. She had tracked the address from a message Rita sent Chuka. It was time to stop crying. Time to speak. As she entered, two attendants looked up and quickly stepped aside, sensing that this woman wasn't here to shop. Rita stood at the far end, arranging some expensive handbags on a glass shelf. She was tall, poised, dressed in a navy jumpsuit that hugged her body without trying too hard. Her hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail, and her makeup was flawless. She looked every bit the kind of woman Chuka would fall for, confident, elegant, and untouchable. Amaka's breath hitched for a moment, but she steadied herself. This was not about fear. This was about reclaiming her space. "Are you Rita?" Amaka asked, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. Rita turned around slowly, her expression unreadable. "Yes. Can I help you?" Amaka took a step closer. "Stay away from my husband." Her voice cracked, but her eyes were steady. Rita raised an eyebrow and folded her arms. "Your husband?" she said coolly. "Oh, you must be Amaka." That stung. She knew her name. She had always known. "You know who I am," Amaka snapped. "And still, you text him, kiss him, sleep with him. I came here to tell you, enough is enough." Rita didn't flinch. She simply walked closer until they were face to face. "You don't know the half of it," she said softly. "You think I want your husband for love? Amaka, I chose him. But not for the reasons you think." There was something strange in her voice, not arrogance, but purpose. Amaka blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Rita smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You'll understand soon. I suggest you stop fighting the wrong enemy." She turned and walked away, leaving Amaka standing there, shaken. What did she mean? Why wasn't she denying it? Amaka walked out of the boutique, her heart pounding, her mind spinning. There was something deeper happening, something beyond infidelity. That evening, she sat alone in the living room, staring into space while Chuka watched football in the bedroom, laughing with friends over the phone. Amaka didn't cry that night. Instead, she began thinking, really thinking, for the first time in weeks. Rita's words echoed in her mind like a riddle. I chose him not for the reasons you think. Amaka didn't know what was coming yet, but something inside her whispered, you're standing at the edge of truth. Amaka sat by the window long after the sun had set, staring into the quiet street below. Her Bible rested on her lap, open to the Psalms, though her eyes hadn't moved past the same verse for hours. She had cooked dinner and set the table like she always did, placing Chuka's favorite plate at the head, even adding extra fried plantain like he liked. But hours passed, and he didn't show. No calls. No text. No explanation. She didn't eat. She didn't touch the food. She just sat there in silence, the flicker of the candle casting long shadows on the wall behind her. The power had gone out earlier, and even the generator refused to start. It felt symbolic. Her home, once bright and hopeful, was now silent, dark, and cold, just like her heart. Still, she waited, hoping that maybe this time he would walk through the door and say, I'm sorry. But that hope had started to rot. Midnight came, and Chuka was still not home. Amaka moved to the couch, hugging a throw pillow tightly to her chest. The only sound was the ticking wall clock, marking each second of her heartbreak. At 1:47 a.m., the door creaked open. Chuka stepped in, smelling of wine and an unfamiliar cologne. He looked startled to see her still awake. What are you doing up? He asked, slightly annoyed. Amaka stared at him without a word. Her eyes were swollen, but dry. She didn't shout. She didn't ask questions. She simply rose from the couch, picked up the cold plate of untouched food, and walked into the kitchen. Chuka stood there for a moment, then shrugged and went into the bedroom. She heard his belt drop to the floor and the creak of the bed as he lay down. Not a single word of explanation, not even a lie. That night, Amaka didn't sleep. She curled up on the cold kitchen floor, wrapped in her wrapper, and stared at the flickering candle until it died. She felt like it, barely holding on, and then gone. As dawn approached, Amaka's mind spiraled. She thought of the wedding night, when he had kissed her fingers one by one, promising to protect her heart. She thought of the days she starved so he could eat, the times she borrowed money and lied about it so he wouldn't feel guilty. And now he was coming home late without apology, smelling of another woman, and treating her like a ghost in her own house. Her heart ached, not just from betrayal, but from the realization that she had become invisible. She was a shadow of herself, faithful, silent, forgotten. The worst part wasn't that Chuka had changed. It was that she had stayed the same, hoping love would be enough. But the light in her heart, that final flicker of loyalty, had finally gone out. It was 3 days after that night when Rita came to Amaka, not in a dream, not in a confrontation, but in quiet, calculated confidence. They ran into each other at a high-end charity auction organized by one of Chuka's associates. Amaka had been invited reluctantly, wearing a borrowed dress and a tired smile, simply to maintain appearances. Rita, on the other hand, was radiant, dressed in a deep emerald gown, hair pulled into a regal bun, with a pair of pearl earrings that glimmered under the chandelier light. Amaka watched her glide through the crowd like she belonged. But it wasn't until Rita approached with a glass of wine in one hand and a haunting smile that Amaka realized this encounter was no coincidence. "I've been wanting to talk to you," Rita said softly. Amaka bristled. "I don't have anything to say to you." But Rita didn't flinch. "Then listen." They stepped outside to the balcony, away from the noise. Rita leaned against the marble rail, eyes fixed on the city lights below. "You're not my enemy, Amaka," she began. "I didn't enter Chuka's life because I loved him. I entered it because I wanted him to suffer, slowly, silently." Amaka's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Rita turned to her. 7 years ago, I lost my only child. We were evicted from our home by a property developer who bought our land through a forged deal. We had nowhere to go. My son, Chika, caught an infection from sleeping outside a clinic's emergency gate. He died in my arms. Her voice broke, but she didn't cry. "Do you know who signed that development clearance?" Chuka Obesai, your husband. Amaka staggered back, as if struck. No, that can't be true. But in her soul, something clicked. The puzzle was coming together. I came into his life to ruin him. And I won't stop until he pays. Amaka was speechless. Her first instinct was denial, then anger. But beneath the flood of emotion was a rising wave of clarity. It explained everything. Rita's calculated charm, her quiet confidence, her refusal to act like a mistress. This wasn't seduction. It was war. And somehow, Amaka was the collateral damage. You used him, Amaka said bitterly. You used me. Rita looked at her, finally showing emotion. At first, yes. But then I really saw you. And I realized you're not the enemy either. You're a victim, just like I was. But the difference is you still have a chance to choose how this ends. She handed Amaka a small flash drive. The documents on here will tell you everything. The land, the signatures, the cover-up. And then she walked away, leaving Amaka standing alone on the balcony, holding the weight of truth in her palm. Her hands shook. Her breath trembled. Her entire world shattered. The next morning, Amaka waited for Chuka to leave the house. She smiled as he kissed her cheek and called her a good woman. He was in a rush, dressing in his usual fine suit, humming like a man with the world at his feet. Once he left, she locked the door, drew the curtains, and knelt in front of the bedroom safe. She knew the combination, his mother's birth date and their wedding year. A painful irony now. With shaking hands, she opened the safe and began digging through the neatly stacked folders. Insurance papers, share certificates, property deeds. And then, hidden beneath it all, was a sealed brown envelope marked confidential. She opened it. Inside were documents bearing Chuka's signature, development contracts, sale agreements, and a scanned eviction notice bearing the stamp of his company. One file had Rita's name on it. Another had a photo of a sickly boy in a hospital wrapper, Chica, written at the bottom. Amaka sat on the floor, the documents spread around her like the ruins of a war she didn't know she was fighting. Her chest heaved with sobs. The tears came hot and fast, not just for Rita, not just for the boy, but for herself. For the woman who had laid beside a man capable of such things. For the wife who begged God to fix a marriage built on deceit. She felt the foundation of her life crumble beneath her. She had built a home on sand, and the truth was the storm that washed it all away. She remembered Rita's voice. I didn't come for love. I came for justice. And now Amaka understood. Rita had once been her, broken, betrayed, and bleeding in silence. But instead of dying in the pain, she turned it into power. Amaka wiped her eyes. No more crying. No more begging. If this house was going to burn, she would not be the woman left behind in the smoke. She packed the documents into her bag and stood up. Her legs felt weak, but her spirit had never been stronger. The woman who stared back at her in the mirror was no longer afraid. She had the truth now, truth that could destroy Chuka, and with it, everything he had built on her back. And for the first time in years, Amaka realized she was not powerless. She had the fire. And now, thanks to Rita, she had the match. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with awakening. The woman who had cried herself to sleep for months was gone. What stood now was a woman ready to reclaim her story, not with noise, not with fists, but with precision. And as she walked out of the bedroom with Rita's flash drive and Chuka's lies in her purse, the real war finally began. Amaka sat quietly on the park bench with the morning breeze brushing against her skin, her hands clutching the printed documents she had photocopied from Chuka's safe. The world around her moved, children playing, traders hawking snacks, buses honking in the distance. But she sat still, unmoving, eyes fixed on nothing and everything. The weight of the truth she had uncovered the day before still pressed down on her chest like a stone. Every page had revealed not just her husband's betrayal, but his carelessness with the lives of others. He had been the hand that signed away a child's future, the name behind the eviction, the cause of a mother's tears. It wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was deeper. This was about injustice. And somewhere in that maze of emotions, She realized Rita hadn't come to destroy her marriage out of envy, but to balance a scale the world had tilted. Amaka's tears had dried, but her heart remained heavy. When Rita arrived at the agreed cafe, there was no animosity in her face. She walked with slow grace and sat opposite Amaka, placing her phone on the table, eyes meeting hers without apology. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Amaka broke the silence. "He did it," she whispered. "Everything you said was true." Rita nodded, her expression unreadable. "I never lied to you." Amaka blinked slowly, her voice cracking. "But why me? Why let me suffer too?" Rita's face softened for the first time. "Because I thought you were like him. I thought you were part of it. Until I saw your eyes, saw your pain. And I realized you're just me from years ago." Amaka looked away, fighting the tears that threatened to return. "Then help me," she said finally. "I don't want revenge. I want restoration. I want to make him feel what it's like to be helpless." Rita smiled, not with cruelty, but with understanding. "Then let's take everything." The two women sat for hours, not as rivals, but as reflections. Rita shared her journey, how she rose from homelessness to wealth using the pain that once crippled her. How she watched Amaka for months before making her move. "You were the only thing holding him up," Rita said softly. "And I needed to make sure that when he fell, he would feel the void." Amaka listened in silence, stunned by the precision of it all. But as the day wore on, something shifted. What began as distrust became unity. They weren't two broken women anymore. They were survivors, both silenced, both betrayed, now rising from the ashes. Amaka extended her hand. "We do this together. But I want him to see our faces when it happens." Rita took her hand. "Agreed. Let's destroy his empire, quietly, legally, and permanently." For the next 2 weeks, Amaka and Rita met in secret, in cafes, salons, even inside Amaka's old church vestry. They knew they couldn't be seen together publicly yet. Rita explained her plan with the calm of a strategist. "Chuka has been bragging about a new land deal in Port Harcourt," she said one evening. "But he's funding it through Shell investors under your name." Amaka's eyes widened. "My name?" Rita nodded. "Yes. You're still legally tied to most of his documents. That gives us leverage. We just need to redirect it." They crafted a fake investment partnership under a neutral company registered in Chuka's company's name. It would appear as an opportunity too good to ignore. Fast return, offshore holding, minimal risk. Rita handled the legal deception. Amaka gathered Chuka's signatures during nights when he was too distracted or drunk to notice. They worked like shadows, building a fortress brick by brick, not of revenge, but of recovery. Amaka used her silence as a weapon. She no longer argued, no longer cried. She cooked when necessary, smiled faintly when spoken to, and played the part of the supportive wife perfectly. Chuka, oblivious, took it as submission. He mistook her quiet for surrender. "You see," he said one morning as he zipped up his trousers, "you're finally learning to stay in your lane." Amaka just nodded, her heart steel under her skin. She knew every word he spoke, every signature he scrawled, was tightening the noose he didn't know existed. Rita had also prepared false invoices and subtle bank withdrawals. "The goal isn't to ruin him suddenly," she explained. "It's to make him hand over everything willingly, believing he's winning." Amaka marveled at her clarity. "You've done this before?" she asked. Rita chuckled darkly. "Let's just say I learned the hard way that the law doesn't protect women like us unless we learn to write it ourselves." The final phase was delicate. They needed one last signature, the one that would transfer Chuka's entire real estate assets into a trust created in the name Chika Legacy Holdings. It was disguised as a foreign investment policy document. Rita timed it perfectly, during a high-profile gala Chuka had been dying to attend. Amaka would arrive late, claim she was unwell, and quietly slide the documents into his file folder between the catering bills and receipts. Chuka, eager to finalize the deal before closing, would sign them absent-mindedly in front of witnesses. "He loves being the center of attention," Amaka whispered. "He won't even check." Rita smiled. then let him sign away his future. That night, Amaka stood before the mirror in a shimmering gold dress Rita had picked out. She looked regal, powerful. For the first time in years, she didn't see a woman waiting to be loved. She saw a woman who had outgrown her cage. The gala was dazzling. Celebrities, politicians, and socialites filled the venue, sipping champagne and posing for cameras. Chuka arrived beaming, surrounded by his new friends, men who called him chairman, and women who touched his arm a little too long. He laughed loudly, boasting about the Port Harcourt expansion, waving to the press with practiced charm. Amaka arrived shortly after, entering quietly with elegance that turned heads. Her gown flowed like silk, her makeup soft but bold. For once, she didn't look like the woman who used to cry into her pillow. She looked like she belonged in every room she stepped into. Chuka, surprised but pleased, kissed her cheek and whispered, "You're learning, baby." She smiled back, her heart calm. It was the last kiss he would ever give her with power in his hands. During dinner, Amaka slipped the final document into the brown folder of contracts Chuka had brought along. It sat between harmless papers, unnoticed. When the MC announced final acknowledgments for business excellence, Chuka grinned and stood to address the room. "We're building something timeless," he declared, holding up his pen. "This deal is the future of real estate in Nigeria." Laughter and applause filled the air. Then, with flair, he opened the folder and began signing. Each signature, each swipe of ink, was another surrender of everything he thought was his. The company, the land, the properties. All of it now belonged to Chika Legacy Holdings, managed by a woman he once ignored and another he had underestimated. When he finished signing, he raised the documents like a trophy, smiling wide as photographers captured the moment. He didn't know he had just gifted his entire empire to the ghosts of the past. Amaka walked out before the speeches ended. She didn't need to stay. She didn't need applause. She had already won. Outside, Rita was waiting in a car parked across the street. Amaka entered quietly, closing the door behind her. "He signed," she whispered. Rita smiled and started the engine. "Then it's done." They drove away in silence, the weight of years finally beginning to lift. Amaka looked out the window, tears threatening. But this time they were not from pain. They were from liberation. Chuka had used her, abused her loyalty, dismissed her worth. And now, with the stroke of a pen, she had taken back everything he stole, not just assets, but identity. And as the gala lights faded into the distance behind them, she whispered one final word to herself: free. Chuka woke up the next morning in high spirits, still riding the high from the previous night's gala. His phone buzzed with congratulations. Headlines flashed his photo. Real estate mogul Chuka Obasai finalizes landmark deal. He grinned as he scrolled through social media, barely hearing Amaka quietly folding laundry in the corner. "You see what happens when people believe in you," he said aloud, not expecting her to respond. He got dressed in his favorite blue suit, humming as he sprayed his perfume, then grabbed his briefcase and car keys. "See you tonight, baby," he said with a wink. Amaka only nodded, her face unreadable. He didn't notice. He was too proud to see what was coming. When he arrived at his office building, something strange happened. The gate guards, usually quick to salute and open the barriers, hesitated. One whispered something into his colleague's ear. Chuka lowered his window. "Is there a problem?" The senior guard straightened nervously. "Sorry, sir, we were told your access has been restricted." Chuka laughed. "Restricted how? I own this place." But when he tried his key card at the gate scanner, the screen blinked red. Access denied. Confused and irritated, he called his assistant. No answer. He called the HR manager. Voicemail. Panic began to creep in. He marched to the side entrance, banged on the door until the security chief came down. "Sir," the man said quietly, "your name has been removed from the system. The board had an emergency meeting this morning. You've been relieved of all duties pending investigation." Chuka's jaw dropped. "What investigation?" The man shook his head. "Financial misappropriation. Fraud. Misuse of company assets." Chuka staggered backward. "That's impossible. I signed." He stopped mid-sentence. He remembered the papers, the gala, the folder. By the time Chuka returned to his car, everything had started to unravel. Multiple alerts popped up on his phone: bank restrictions, account freezes, urgent calls from legal firms. He called his lawyer. "Sir, we've been trying to reach you," the man said. "You signed over your shares and your properties to an entity called Chika Legacy Holdings. It's airtight. Your company isn't yours anymore." Chuka felt the blood drain from his face. "What do you mean? How is that possible? That document, you signed it. In public. On camera. Witnessed and notarized. We can't fight it unless you can prove fraud." But Chuka didn't hear the rest. His phone slipped from his fingers. Everything he built, the empire he crushed people for, was gone. And the worst part? He had given it away with his own hands, in front of a cheering crowd. Chuka stormed into the house like a man possessed. Amaka was sitting at the dining table, calmly peeling oranges. He threw his briefcase across the room, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "What the hell's going on, Amaka?" he shouted, eyes bloodshot, veins bulging at his neck. She didn't flinch. She placed a slice of orange on her tongue and chewed slowly. "You're back early," she said softly. "I thought you'd be out celebrating your success." He slammed his palm on the table. "Don't play games with me. I know what you did. You and that witch Rita." Amaka raised a hand, cutting him off. "Lower your voice. You're in my house." He blinked, stunned. "You're what?" She rose, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out a slim file. "I believe this is what you're looking for," she said, handing it to him. Inside were copies of the signed transfer documents, properties, shares, vehicles, all legally transferred to Chika Global Trust, with Amaka as the sole overseer. "I built this," he screamed. "With my blood, my sweat. You have no right." Amaka laughed for the first time in weeks, a deep, shaking laugh that echoed with pain and freedom. "You built this," she said, eyes flashing. "Who sold her mother's land? Who begged, borrowed, and starved so you could print flyers for your dream? Who borrowed money from Anom and was humiliated in the market? Who stood by you when your own family called you a fool? You didn't build this alone, Chuka. You built it on my back." He staggered backward, unable to respond. "You wanted a prenup? You got one," she added. "Only this time, it's me who gets to walk away with everything." He looked around, suddenly seeing the house, the furniture, the curtains, the art on the wall, not as his possessions, but as memories of a woman he had ignored, ridiculed, and betrayed. Chuka sank to his knees, defeated. "Amaka, please," he whispered. "Let's talk. We can fix this." She looked down at him, the same man who once made her beg for affection, who once told her she didn't belong in his future. Now he was groveling, broken. But there was no pity left in her heart. Only clarity. "You signed away your empire chasing a woman you didn't understand," she said coldly. "You gave away your home because you thought I was too weak to fight. Now you're just a guest in a place you used to rule." She turned and walked to the door. "Pack your things. I want you out by morning." And as she stepped into the sunlight outside, she felt something rise in her chest, not revenge, not anger, but something far more powerful: peace. That evening, while Amaka was watching the sunset from the balcony, her phone buzzed. A voice note from an unknown number. She played it, and Rita's calm voice filled the air. "I suppose by now he knows," she began. "You don't owe me anything, Amaka. You've already given me more than you know. When I lost my son, I lost the will to fight. I became bitter, hollow. But watching you rise from tears to fire, reminded me of who I was before the pain. Thank you for making me believe again." Amaka closed her eyes, allowing the words to settle in her soul. Rita continued, "I never wanted his money. I never wanted his love. I just wanted him to feel what I felt, the helplessness, the injustice. And now he does. That's enough." Amaka pressed the phone to her chest, her heart heavy with unexpected emotion. Rita had disappeared. No address, no goodbye, only that voice note and a small handwritten letter she had dropped at the gate earlier. It read, "Chika can finally rest now. Justice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Farewell." Amaka folded the note carefully and tucked it into her Bible. She felt a strange bond with Rita now, two women from different pasts, brought together by pain, transformed by truth. There were no medals, no applause, just the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming what had been taken. She didn't know where Rita had gone, but wherever she was, Amaka prayed peace would find her. The same peace now blooming in her own chest like sunrise after a long storm. That night, the house was quiet. Chuka had locked himself in the guest room, the man who once ruled with arrogance, now humbled into silence. Amaka walked through the living room, touching objects that had once been his trophies, a gift watch from the governor, an award plaque, a framed newspaper cover. They were hollow now, meaningless. She sat at the piano he once mocked her for playing and let her fingers dance across the keys. It wasn't a song. It wasn't perfect. But it was hers. And as the music filled the room, she smiled for the first time without pain. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, maybe even loneliness. But for the first time in years, she was no longer living behind a man's shadow. She was her own mirror. And she finally liked what she saw. Chuka wandered through the empty living room, barefoot, disheveled, and distant. The man who once strutted through life with expensive suits and louder-than-life confidence now looked like a ghost. His beard had grown patchy, his eyes sunken, and his phone was silent. Not a single call from those who once hailed him. His business partners had cut him off after the news of the property transfer broke. His bank accounts were frozen pending audit. And his own lawyers refused to take his calls after discovering the legitimacy of the documents he had signed. The same gala that once crowned him the king of real estate had become the moment he unknowingly surrendered everything. Now, his name trended for all the wrong reasons. Greedy CEO fooled by his wife and mistress. Read one headline. Signed his empire away in front of Lagos elite. Read another. No one was laughing with him anymore. They were laughing at him. He stood in front of a long hallway mirror, the same one he once admired himself in before business meetings. But today, the reflection hit differently. He didn't recognize the man staring back, pale, hollow, with regret bleeding from his eyes. He punched the mirror once, shattering part of it, but his own reflection still stared at him from the broken pieces. And behind every crack, he saw memories. Amaka serving him food with joy in her eyes. Amaka fainting in church while he rolled his eyes. Amaka warning him gently about losing himself. He remembered ignoring her, mocking her, trading her loyalty for momentary lust. He had thrown away gold for glitter. And now the glitter had dulled, and the gold had walked out the front door with her head high. He dropped to his knees and screamed, not in anger, but in the agony of a man who finally realized he was the villain in his own story. Days passed, but things didn't get better. Chuka received notice that the house he once called his own had officially been listed under Chika Global Trust. His car was repossessed for unpaid lease. His accounts showed less than 50,000 Nigerian nairas across 5 banks. The driver stopped coming. The gardener quit. Even the security guards at the estate gate now looked at him with pity instead of respect. Alone, with nothing but his shame, Chuka finally did the one thing he never thought he'd do. He called Amaka. But she didn't pick. He left voice notes, sent long texts begging for forgiveness, promising to be a better man, asking to start again. Her reply came in just 2 words, start over. It wasn't a rejection. It was liberation, not for him, but for herself. Chuka finally understood. Sometimes, when you break a woman who was sent to build you, she doesn't just leave. She rebuilds without you. The sky was calm the day Amaka stood before her late mother's grave, wearing a simple white blouse and blue wrapper. Her face glowed, not with makeup, but with peace. She had come to thank the woman whose name she had carried, whose lessons had carried her through heartbreak and fire. In her hands was a fresh bouquet of hibiscus flowers, her mother's favorite. She knelt, placed the flowers gently, and whispered, "Mama, I made it. I didn't become bitter. I became better." The wind blew softly, like an answer. Behind her stood a sleek black SUV, a gift from the company she now controlled. Her name was now on papers, titles, and legal boards. But more importantly, her name was now whole. no longer tethered to the shadow of a man who tried to erase her. Rita had sent one last email, short, simple, and filled with hope. She was abroad now, starting a small foundation in memory of Chica. Not the public kind, she wrote, just one that helps single mothers like I once was, quietly, honestly. She added a picture of a new apartment with a photo of her son on the mantel. Amaka smiled, replied with blessings, and wished her peace. They were not best friends, not soul sisters. But they had become something stronger. Women who turned their pain into power, their silence into strategy. No vengeance could ever restore what they lost. But they chose healing, not for him, but for themselves. Amaka now led a new life. She had taken a short legal course and was training to help women in abusive relationships navigate property laws. She didn't want applause. She wanted change, quiet, lasting change. One evening, months later, Amaka sat at the same window where she once waited for Chuka to come home. But this time, she wasn't waiting. She was sipping tea, reading a manuscript for a new policy proposal on women's property rights. She smiled as her phone rang. It was her younger sister, inviting her to speak at a local church program on rebuilding after heartbreak. She accepted. Before going to bed, she stood once again in front of the mirror, the same mirror that once reflected pain, betrayal, and loss. But now it reflected strength, beauty, and freedom. She touched her reflection gently and whispered, "This is who I was all along." And somewhere in a small guest room, Chuka sat on the floor, listening to his own voice note to Amaka that remained unopened. Because some women don't get their power from revenge, they get it from rising. And when they walk away, they never look back. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.